To truly understand the Russia-Ukraine war, one must travel back not just to February 24, 2022, the day Russia launched its full-scale invasion, but much further into history, to the final days of the Soviet Union, when the world map was being redrawn and the fate of nations was being decided in smoke-filled rooms far from the people who would be most affected. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine emerged as an independent nation for the first time in modern history, a vast country of over 40 million people sitting right at the crossroads between Russia and Western Europe. Ukraine inherited not only its territory but also a massive stockpile of nuclear weapons, in fact, the third largest nuclear arsenal in the entire world at the time. However, in 1994, in an agreement known as the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine voluntarily surrendered all of its nuclear weapons in exchange for security guarantees from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, who all promised to respect Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. That agreement would later prove to be one of the most consequential and arguably most tragic diplomatic decisions of the post-Cold War era, because Russia, one of the very signatories of that agreement, would go on to be the country that violated it most dramatically. For the next 2 decades, Ukraine walked a difficult path, trying to balance its historical, cultural, and economic ties with Russia, while also looking westward toward the European Union and NATO. The internal tension between these two visions for Ukraine's future was always simmering just below the surface, and it finally exploded in late 2013 when Ukraine's then-president Viktor Yanukovych, under heavy pressure from Moscow, abruptly rejected a landmark association agreement with the European Union that would have brought Ukraine closer to Europe economically and politically. That decision triggered one of the most significant protest movements in post-Soviet history, the Euromaidan protests, also known as the Revolution of Dignity, where hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians poured into Kiev's Maidan Nezalezhnosti, Independence Square, demanding a pro-European future and an end to corruption. The protests lasted for months, turned violent, and in February 2014, Yanukovych fled the country to Russia under the weight of the uprising. Russia, unwilling to accept this outcome and viewing the revolution as a Western-backed coup designed to pull Ukraine out of its sphere of influence, responded swiftly and forcefully. Within days of Yanukovych's departure, pro-Russian armed men, later confirmed to be Russian soldiers without insignia, nicknamed Little Green Men, began seizing strategic locations across the Crimean Peninsula in southern Ukraine. In March 2014, after a highly controversial referendum that was widely rejected by the international community as illegitimate, Russia officially annexed Crimea, a move condemned by the United Nations General Assembly and described by the West as a clear violation of international law and the very Budapest Memorandum that Russia had signed. The conflict did not stop at Crimea. By April 2014, Russian-backed separatist forces seized territory in Ukraine's eastern Donbas region, specifically in the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, declaring the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. A low-intensity war in eastern Ukraine began and dragged on for 8 years, with 2 ceasefire agreements, the Minsk I in 2014 and Minsk II in 2015, failing to bring any lasting peace. Over those 8 years, more than 14,000 people were killed in the Donbas conflict and millions of people were displaced. Throughout this period, Russia's official position was that it was not a party to the conflict, claiming that the separatists were acting independently, a claim that was never taken seriously by Ukraine or the Western world. Meanwhile, the question of NATO expansion continued to fuel tensions. Russia had been deeply opposed to NATO's eastward expansion ever since the alliance began admitting former Soviet bloc countries in the late 1990s. Russian President Vladimir Putin had made it abundantly clear on numerous occasions that he viewed Ukraine's potential membership in NATO as a direct existential threat to Russia's security. At the 2008 NATO summit in Bucharest, the alliance had stated that both Ukraine and Georgia would eventually become NATO members, a declaration that Moscow viewed with fury. Over the following years, NATO and Ukraine deepened their cooperation, with Ukraine receiving training, equipment, and technical assistance from NATO members. Western analysts disagree about whether NATO expansion was the true cause of Russia's aggression. Many scholars argue that Putin's real motivation was his refusal to accept Ukraine as a genuinely independent nation with its own sovereign right to choose its alliances. But the narrative of NATO encirclement became the central justification that Russia used to build its case for war, both domestically and internationally. By late 2021, Russia had massed over 100,000 troops along Ukraine's borders in what it described as military exercises, Western intelligence agencies, particularly the United States, publicly warned that Russia was planning a full-scale invasion. Diplomatic efforts intensified in the final weeks before the war, with meetings and phone calls between world leaders, but they ultimately failed. On February 24, 2022, a date that will be remembered in history alongside other days of infamy, Russia launched a massive, multi-axis military invasion of Ukraine, striking from the north through Belarus toward Kyiv, from the east into the Donbas, and from the south out of Crimea. Putin announced the operation as a special military operation with the stated goals of denazifying and demilitarizing Ukraine, claims that were immediately and widely dismissed as baseless propaganda, given that Ukraine was a functioning democracy with a Jewish president, Volodymyr Zelensky, who had been democratically elected in 2019 with 73% of the vote. Russia's initial war plan was catastrophically miscalculated. Russian military planners had apparently assumed that Kyiv would fall within days, that the Ukrainian military would collapse, and that the Ukrainian people would welcome Russian forces, or at least not resist meaningfully. None of that happened. Ukraine's armed forces mounted a fierce and surprisingly effective defense, aided by massive supplies of weapons, intelligence, and financial support from the United States and its European allies. The Russian advance on Kyiv was repelled, and by the end of March 2022, Russian forces had withdrawn from northern Ukraine, redeploying to focus on the east and south. The war then transformed into a grinding, attritional conflict reminiscent of the World War I trench warfare, with both sides suffering enormous casualties and the front lines shifting slowly and at tremendous cost in human lives. Over the following months and years, Russia made gradual gains in the east, while Ukraine launched several major counteroffensives, most notably in the Kharkiv and Kherson regions in late 2022, where Ukrainian forces recaptured significant territory. In 2023, Ukraine launched a large summer counteroffensive that was widely anticipated but ultimately failed to achieve the decisive breakthrough that Kyiv and its Western allies had hoped for, running into heavily fortified Russian defensive lines. Russia then seized the initiative in 2024 and began making slow but steady advances in the Donbas, capturing the city of Avdiivka in February 2024 after months of brutal fighting. By the time the war reached its 4-year anniversary on February 24, 2026, Russia occupied roughly 20% of Ukraine's internationally recognized territory, including all of Crimea, most of the Donbas, and significant portions of Zaporizhzhia and Kherson oblasts, though Ukraine still controls the city of Kherson itself. Despite Russia's overall territorial control, the pace of advance remained agonizingly slow. During all of 2025, Russia gained only approximately 0.8% of Ukraine's territory, or about 1,265 square miles, at an almost incomprehensible cost in human lives. The human toll of this war is staggering and difficult to fully comprehend. According to estimates compiled by credible military analysts at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, Russian forces have suffered nearly 1.2 million casualties, making this the most costly war for any major power since World War II, and at the current rate of attrition, combined Russian and Ukrainian military casualties could reach 2 million by the spring of 2026. The civilian toll, tracked by the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, stood at 56,950 verified casualties by January 31, 2026, including 15,172 civilians confirmed killed and 41,378 injured. But the UN itself acknowledges that the true numbers are almost certainly significantly higher, as many casualties in active conflict zones go unverified. The year 2025 was the deadliest year for civilians since the earliest months of the invasion, with at least 2,526 civilians killed and 12,162 injured, representing a 31% increase in civilian casualties compared to 2024 and a 70% increase compared to 2023, a deeply alarming trend that reflects Russia's increasingly indiscriminate strikes on Ukrainian cities, energy infrastructure, and civilian areas. Nearly 10 million Ukrainians remain displaced by the war, a staggering number representing roughly a quarter of Ukraine's pre-war population. By September 2025, 5.75 million Ukrainian refugees had been recorded globally, with 5.2 million of them sheltering across Europe, while an additional 3.7 million people remained internally displaced within Ukraine itself as of January 2026. Germany, Poland, and other European countries have absorbed the largest numbers of Ukrainian refugees in what has become Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II. The international response to the war has been extraordinary in scale. The United States, under President Biden's administration through early 2025, committed enormous resources to Ukraine's defense. According to the U.S. State Department, the United States provided $66.9 billion in military assistance alone from the start of the full-scale invasion through January 2025, and the total U.S. congressional spending related to the Ukraine war reached $188 billion as of December 31, 2025. Europe has also contributed massively. From January 2022 through August 2025, Europe as a whole spent $201.7 billion in total aid to Ukraine, compared to the United States' $130.6 billion over the same period. Western nations also imposed sweeping economic sanctions on Russia targeting its banking sector, energy exports, technology imports, and the personal assets of Russian oligarchs and officials. These sanctions have inflicted real damage on Russia's economy. Russia's energy revenues dropped by approximately a fifth in 2025, manufacturing has been declining, economic growth slowed to just 0.6% in 2025, and according to Rand Corporation analysts, Russia's fiscal problems are growing, and the country may be on the verge of more serious economic difficulties. Nevertheless, Russia has proven more economically resilient than many Western analysts initially predicted, partly by pivoting its trade toward China, India, and other countries that have declined to join the sanctions regime. Military think tanks, including the International Institute for Strategic Studies, assessed as of February 2026 that Russia will be able to sustain its invasion throughout 2026, even accounting for its growing economic and manpower pressures, while its military capacity, though strained, has not collapsed. One of the most dramatic and unexpected developments of the war has been Ukraine's strike campaign deep inside Russian territory. Ukraine has attacked military facilities, ammunition depots, oil refineries, and airfields inside Russia, causing significant damage and demonstrating that Russia itself is not immune from the war's consequences. Russia has responded to these strikes and to its frustrations on the battlefield by dramatically escalating its attacks on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, particularly its power grid and energy system. On the night of February 25 to 26, 2026, Russia launched another massive combined missile and drone strike targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure, leaving large parts of the country in darkness and cold. According to the Atlantic Council, a key feature of Russia's strategy going forward is to make Ukraine increasingly unlivable by systematically destroying its essential infrastructure, including railways, power generation, and heating systems, hoping that Ukrainian resilience and Western support will eventually crack under the pressure. The political dimensions of the war shifted significantly when Donald Trump won the U.S. presidential election in November 2024 and returned to the White House in January 2025. During his campaign, Trump had repeatedly claimed he would end the war in Ukraine within 24 hours of taking office. That promise proved impossible to keep. The war remains ongoing more than a year into his second term. Renewed peace negotiations did begin in 2025 after Trump took office, with his administration formulating peace proposals that were described by analysts at the Council on Foreign Relations as generally favorable to Russia and that crossed multiple Ukrainian and European red lines. A December 2025 survey showed that 59% of Ukrainians oppose holding elections before fighting ends and a peace deal is reached, reflecting deep public distrust of any rushed settlement that might reward Russian aggression. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has argued publicly and in a phone call with Trump on February 25, 2026, that Russia is deliberately playing games with the peace process to stall negotiations and buy time for more military gains. As of late February 2026, Bloomberg reported that Trump's peace efforts were stalling, with peace talks deadlocked and the fighting continuing largely at a standstill along the approximately 1,000-kilometer front line. Europe, concerned about the long-term implications of a peace deal that legitimizes Russian territorial conquest, has been actively working to help Ukraine resist what Chatham House analysts described as a U.S. push for peace at any price. 9 European nations have pledged to increase their defense budgets to 5% of national income over the coming years, and European leaders have been working to build up the continent's own defense industrial base so that Europe can continue to support Ukraine even if U.S. support wavers or is reduced. As the war enters its 5th year, the fundamental questions remain unresolved. Russia has failed to achieve its original stated objectives of demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine, has not managed to install a pro-Russian government in Kiev, and has paid an almost unimaginable price in human lives and economic damage, yet it continues to hold significant Ukrainian territory and shows no signs of abandoning its war aims. Ukraine, for its part, has demonstrated extraordinary resilience and military capability, surviving what many thought would be a quick Russian conquest and inflicting catastrophic losses on the invading force, yet it too has paid an enormous price in lives, displacement, infrastructure destruction, and economic damage, and faces the difficult reality of a long war against a much larger neighbor with deeper military and demographic reserves. The world is watching one of the most consequential conflicts since World War II, a war that has already reshaped European security, accelerated NATO expansion with Finland and Sweden joining the alliance, transformed global energy markets, deepened divisions between Russia and the West to Cold War lows, and raised fundamental questions about the future of the rules-based international order. What comes next is uncertain. A negotiated ceasefire that freezes the conflict along current lines, a continued grinding war of attrition, or some unexpected military or political development that changes the equation entirely. But what is certain is that the Russia-Ukraine war has already left a mark on history that will take generations to fully understand, and the people of Ukraine, who never asked for this war, continue to pay the heaviest price of all.